Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and today I am joined by my father, Dr. Scott Keith, and by Dr. Adam Francisco as we continue our Why You Should series. The Thinking Fellows is brought to you by the 1517 podcast network of shows. You can go to 1517.org/podcast to see all 18 shows that we produce there. You can also just go to 1517.org generally to see the rest of our projects. We have daily blogs, weekly preaching helps, regular YouTube video series, and so much more. If you enjoy the Thinking Fellows or find it useful, there is likely something over there that you could find helpful for use either personally or in your congregation. All right, guys. Why you should. We stumble on some thematic episodes that kind of fall in line for a while, and then we have to break the mold. So we kind of did Adam and I broke the mold last week, I think, doing apologetics. We've had some episodes without the old man, haven't we, Adam?
Yeah, where was it?
There are things I want to say, but I don't want to pick on the elderly.
I believe you were caught deathly ill by the algae bloom.
Oh, yeah. That was horrible.
Yes, if there is an algae warning on your lake, highly suggest not letting your dog run into it.
Or yourself. Or
you might end up sick.
Yes, that was horrible.
Yeah, so highly suggest not getting the algae.
Mm-hmm.
So we did a Why You Should study apologetics last week. This week we're gonna do a Reformation topic, mix it up, get to our bread and butter a little bit, and we're gonna do why and what you should read from the Reformers. I think this is a great idea. Adam edited me a little bit. I sent over some show suggestions for 2 episodes, and it was like 2 or 3 episodes going through a systematic theology each time. And I think he rightly suggested that we would put the audience to sleep if we just went week to week. Lochi to Institutes to, I don't know, maybe Chemnitz Lochi after that. We're just gonna put people to bed, right?
I just think it would be tedious for people who aren't really interested in that stuff.
That's a fair point. So we can do this.
There are people that aren't really interested in that stuff.
Like the normal smart people.
Yeah. Okay.
People who have valuable things to do with their day.
Yeah.
But what we can do is we can condense that into a why and what you should read from the Reformers. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about the idea of the Reformers. Like, who does that constitute? What's the
question?
I mean, I think there's a clear beginning to the Reformers and individual, but what's the end cutoff and who's important in between? There's a lot of people writing during the Reformation, but is there a list that constitutes sort of the Reformers, generally speaking?
There are a couple different scholars in an earlier generation who made the distinction between the magisterial Reformation, and that would be the Lutheran Reformation, that would be the Reformed tradition, Calvin. Zwingli is often included in that list.
And sometimes
then the rest
not.
are all radical reformers, Anabaptists. Those, and what define them as radical is there's a number of things. One is they're rebaptizers, but if you read, it was George Williams, I forget the middle name, Huston or something like that, has this massive text entitled "The Radical Reformation." It goes through everybody from, say, like the Zwickau prophets and Thomas Müntzer to Menno Simons and Sebastian Frank and so on, and they start off Christian, but some of them get quite nutty, such that you get like a Michael Servetus who becomes an anti-Trinitarian, and gets his head cut off for it, and
in Geneva,
so
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you get and I suppose when we talk about the Reformers and the Reformation, we on this show often assume, I guess, what would be titled the Magisterial Reformation, because things like rebaptizers, fall outside of this generic circle of orthodoxy, right? That falls outside of the basic circle of orthodoxy for the Christian faith.
Yeah, and the magisterial Reformation, and Caleb, you're the Latin scholar, the young Latin scholar here.
Yeah,
such
you're
that your dad
plenty,
and I are
you're
old, we've
plenty good
forgotten.
yourself. Yeah.
Magister being a reference to the like Luther and company are connected to the political powers that be in some way. I mean, Luther being protected, and these at least the Lutheran tradition is the first, of course, to be a state-sponsored religion later on in the Reformation.
Yeah, I mean, if you take Lutheranism and then Geneva and then the Anglican Church.
Church of England.
Yep. Those three, I think, end up sort of being at the time the ones that get legal establishment in some form or another. Lutheranism, of course, first, but like quasi-legal, right? Because it's electors and princes, and then even sometimes smaller municipalities than that, offering some sort of legal protection and status, and eventually that status has to do with your association to the Augsburg Confession, being a church of the Augsburg Confession. But the empire doesn't recognize the Church of the Augsburg Confession as legal until the interims, after the interims.
And then only kind of.
And then finally, basically legal after the Book of Concord, right? So, after 1580.
Legal in some of the, I guess you'd call them principalities after 1555, too. Depending on where you lived.
Yeah, depending on where you lived.
And who was prince at the time.
Very often, I think, if you look at sort of, the conflict caused by Melanchthon, sometimes that has to do with casting a net of trying to get more people legal protection from the state.
Yeah, that whole thing was about trying to protect people, and
people can be mad at him for being friendly to, say, particular reformed groups, but part of it was, I think in his mind and his writing, whatever causes the least death and is still acceptable. And it's very easy from just a doctrinal standpoint outside of an area where an army might march in and kill your theologians and leaders and maybe the small army, quote unquote, that people can draft up. It's easy to go, well, you should have never made any concessions ever.
Yeah.
But everything outside of what the empire, directed was an illegal religion.
So we're doing, who should we read within this time frame? So you're kind of limiting it. You're kind of, I guess,
probably the magisterial reformers, I would think.
Yeah, and you're kind of limiting it to 1580 and earlier, or like,
that's probably pretty fair,
15
right?
teens to 1580, that time period.
Yeah. I think that works, right? Adam, that's not just like a Lutheran bias to do that?
Nope.
Okay.
Or,
That's great. So in there, we obviously have Martin Luther. That's probably where the start is, right? 1517, we get Luther. He's the first reformer in the sense of the magisterial Reformation.
Yeah.
Quickly after that, the next most important person who shows up on the scene has got to be Melanchthon.
Yeah.
1519, he starts teaching. That's not too long after. Most important in succession after that, I think Zwingli's a hard one, right? Because of the radical reformers, he's the first. And so you might include him for that reason. And of the radical reformers, Luther certainly takes some time out of his day to talk to Zwingli, to deal with Zwingli.
Yeah, and so beyond that, you would go to Calvin. You might go to Theodore Beza. Who else would you go to?
Chemnitz.
Chemnitz.
Or is he too late?
No, I think he's good.
He's probably the button, right? He's probably the end.
Yeah. You might do Catreus, because I think Catreus on Sacrifice is a good one to look at.
Yeah. You could add Andrea and sort of just cap it as the formulators, I guess.
If you could find anything in English.
Well, you can find the formula
to read.
We could just limit it, though, like you first suggested, to one from the beginning, like Melanchthon's Loci Communis, to one in the middle, Calvin's Institutes, maybe one towards the end, Chemnitz, Two Natures in Christ, or
Oof.
Or even his Lochi, and we could explain sort of the differences there from Melanchthon.
yeah.
I think you got to work in their bondage of the will somewhere.
Oh, yeah, that's good. I mean,
I mean, you're doing like what you need to read from the Reformation, right?
yes.
So if you go like 15 teens and 20s, pick one. Well, you might pick two if you put in bondage of the will. So obviously, you guys are throwing out there Melanchthon's 1521 Lochi, right?
I think you have to.
Which is the
I think if you're going
first edition, the one that Luther said should be added to the canon of Scripture.
Or how about Luther's The Papacy, an Institution of the Devil?
Yeah, anything like that.
that's great.
The three
So
treatises,
obscure.
you should probably read those. I mean, how could you
there's
just stop from
there's so
one
much.
from each era? That'd be
Yeah.
hard.
So if you're going to be like, because we get this right, people get excited about the Reformation and they start diving in. And how do you create a list of essential? You guys have taught. Adam's taught Ren Ref, I think. How do you if you don't have a curriculum and you could just give somebody a reader to make them familiar with the Reformation? Where would you start? I'd probably start with some of the early theses from Luther. I mean, not to peddle my own publications here, but the Heidelberg Disputation is not a horrible place to start because it's a little more theologically concrete than the 95 Theses.
Yeah,
I
that's
agree with
true.
that. Yeah.
I mean, if I'm just, it all depends on context, right? But certainly the three treatises of 1520.
Yeah.
So on the freedom of a Christian, Babylon captivity, and why am I drawing a blank at the other? Scott, help me out here.
I'm just... Well, you did the freedom of the Christian, Babylonian captivity church, and the address to Christian nobility.
That's it. Yeah. Wow, it's been a while. Because those really capture. I mean, that's really where Luther's theology really is starting to take shape.
Yeah,
In a way
it's in an early form still. It's still very against the other in a lot of ways. So that's very much part and parcel for Luther, though. I think we've said on this show before, he's very much an occasional theologian. An occasion arises and he thinks it needs to be addressed, so he writes to the occasion. Unlike somebody like Melanchthon, who is out there writing, Greek textbooks and books on how to preach better homily, the Loci Communes, which is basically a systematic theology. He's sort of developing a curriculum, very much so. He's an educator. That's why they call him the educator of Germany. But Luther is writing two things, two events and two occasions. So
and with those, it's sort of broken up into another theme that comes out of Luther, which is estates, right? You have Christian nobility, you have rulers and princes, as we already established on this episode. That becomes important because this whole thing is not just is theological, but is also legal and has to do with how are leaders going to respond? How are provinces that are falling in line with the Reformation going to continue to live and work within the empire? The freedom of the Christian, general, everyday person. And especially, the freedom of the gospel ends up being a huge sticking point for sort of Catholic reformers like Erasmus. That is one of his greatest fears, and becomes a fear of even some Protestants in some later controversies. So, various controversies on good works and civil behavior, and then you have an address on the Babylonian captivity of the church, which is essentially about sacraments and keeping grace from people and what the church's obligation to proclaim and forgive sins and actually administer sacraments to people as the delivering of Christ's promises and not as sort of a vessel for penance in each case is very important too. So you capture sort of these three realms of living: the church, the state, and the everyday life.
yeah, very much so. And I think I think that's more than intentional when it comes to Luther. You see him do that sort of mixed into his other writings. Adams referenced sort of the importance of the three estates in Luther's theology before, and you see it there. You see it elsewhere. You see it in the Catechism.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if you're wanting to know what the classic Lutheranism in the Reformation before the Book of Concord taught, or what it was trying to do in the parish, if you want to understand that, I think it's the Small Catechism.
Absolutely.
You know? And then but if you're wanting like classic Lutheran theology before the Book of Concord, it's the Loci Communis, right?
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, and you can't go wrong reading. I mean, you should know your catechism anyway, but you can't go wrong reading Loci. I don't know that there's several different editions. Scott, you're the guy on
I
all
would
this,
just do
but,
the 1521. It's the shortest. It's the easiest to consume. It's the least controversial.
Of the translations, I prefer the one that's subtitled like a critical edition.
That's the CPH one. No,
The
No.
not CPH one, the blue one, the blue and green one. It's the
yeah.
here. I will find the translator, but a critical edition. I forget the name of the translator. Not this one. Oh no, it's a whip. It's a whip in stock one.
I don't have that one. So
Well, I took it from you, so you did have that one, and it's filled with copious notes from your dissertation.
then that's one of the older ones that you're referring to, because I didn't
I'll find it, and I'll put it in the show notes.
reprinted on through.
When
Whiff and
Luther
stuff,
says that next to Holy Scripture or Holy Writ, one should include the
This one.
Loci Communis as canonical. Is he referring to that 1521 edition? Is it?
yes. Oh, the Charles Linder Hill one. That's one you're talking about. That's
Charles
never
Linder Hill one.
that's never really referred to as a critical edition.
No, it's this one with the critical
Yeah.
introduction is what they call it. That's right. I was messing up the name. That one, the introduction is helpful, I think, and it is part of what's useful is that that introduction points out many of the changes that Melanchthon puts into place versus a scholastic systematic form, and highlights some of the changes you might not notice, like for instance the removal of not the removal, but there's not a locus on the doctrine of God, and Melanchthon makes special care to say, well, God reveals himself in two words, law and gospel, and so if you want to find the doctrine of God, you're going to find them under the headings law and gospel, because that's where God reveals himself.
Right.
That change is what's in this early Reformation considered very evangelical. That's one of the changes, is that God is not just a list of attributes. God is God reveals himself through two words that he speaks to people. And so it's very important for that. And the Loci changes later on to include things like
It
doctrine of God.
becomes more recognizable as a systematic theology, starting at the doctrine of God and moving with in ordering that you would recognize today if you picked up, if you're Lutheran, if you picked up Mueller's systematic theology, or he goes back to sort of the more classical way of ordering theological topics.
Part of that ends up being is at the beginning, in the 1520s, you're dealing with students who have read and know Lombard sentences and other systematic theology. By the time the Loci becomes the textbook, you now have to teach those students systematic theology. They're not coming in with a different systematic in mind.
Yeah, that's probably part of it. I think some of it for Melanchthon is he starts utilizing classical sources again, and classic sources again, in a heavier way towards the 1530s than he did in the 1520s. In the 1520s, he's captivated by Luther and Luther's sort of method of approaching theology, and by the 1530s, he's sort of melded that back together with a more classical approach to doing it. And there's downside to that for sure. There's probably some upside to it too, but it was a change.
So after that, Adam mentioned the catechisms already. I think, man, we've recommended the Small Catechism 1.5 million times, but still worth noting that that's sort of 1529. That's right before the Augsburg Confession, as far as not at the time confessional document, but used for the practice and teaching of of people in churches. That's a perfect example of something, absolutely essential reading if you're going to, study and love and care about the Reformation.
And it's still today. We're going through that at my church right now. We made it all the way through the second petition of the Lord's Prayer in an hour-long session the other day.
You move at warp speed, don't you?
Yeah.
That's great. And so, go ahead, Adam.
Well, I was thinking for the Reformed tradition, of course, we've already referred to it. The classic there would be Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. I mean, if you want to really catch the spirit of classic Calvinism, that's it. And like the Loci Communis, there's a bunch of different editions. I think he kind of parallels Melanchthon's development in that he originally wrote I don't remember how thick it was, but what was it? Boy, it was 1530s, mid-1530s when he publishes the first one in Latin, and it was intended to be kind of like a catechism, in the sense of small, and then all of a sudden it becomes like in a modern edition, two volumes at least.
Yeah, it's 2 volumes.
The Battles translation. But the thing with Melanchthon is outstanding. Calvin, there's a marked difference though. I know your dad knows quite a bit about this. There's a different spirit, if you will, between, and I'm not suggesting that one's Christian and one's not, but a very different approach to theology between Calvin and Melanchthon, in that Calvin is exacting, not that Melanchthon isn't, but I've heard it said, and I think it's true, somebody confirmed it at some point, one of these Calvin scholars, that Calvin hated to repeat himself. So you'll never read something like when we're reading Luther, you'll hear the same argument over and over again.
Yes, sure will.
With Calvin, if you're reading it, it's the first time and the only time he's going to say it. And he's a guy who wrote commentaries on every single book of the Bible, and he doesn't repeat himself, which is fascinating.
Yeah, that is fascinating.
It's kind of like theology done by lawyer.
Yeah.
With Calvin, whereas Melanchthon's theology done by a humanist and a theologian.
Yeah, well, that would make sense, right? That's.
I mean, he was trained to be a lawyer, right?
The two different ones, yeah. As far as editions of that, the one that's available in English that's very available is the Library of Christian Classics edition. I think it's volume 21 and 22 or 20 and 21. I don't remember. The translate.
Green.
Blue with a green dust jacket.
Oh, green dust jacket.
It's a translator on that is Ford Lewis Battles. It's a very good translation. If you're looking for it, it'll either kind of be Calvin's Institutes, and you can look for the names John T. McNeil or Ford Lewis Battles as the translator and the editor. And I'd say the same thing about the Library of Christian Classics edition of the Loci Communis 1521. I think that one's the Wilhelm Puck, but you can look for that too. If you're looking for like a whole set, Library of Christian Classics set is a good set to have. You used to be able to get that on Christian book distributors. Is that still a thing?
I don't know. I've picked up copies from various used bookstores. So.
Yeah. You used to be able to just get the whole edition or the whole set.
Yeah, interesting. I bet I bet you can get the whole set on like things like Logos still, which I'm sure a lot of our listeners use.
I'm sure you can.
So that's something to look into.
I'm not good at reading on computer screens. So.
Some subscriptions have that, which is good. Yeah, Adam. From a style difference, it's funny because even as Melanchthon gets sort of long-winded as the I guess to say as the Loci gets bigger, right? I actually do think the articles are a little bit more matter of fact and done than when you go into the institutes. Everything's longer-winded is sort of the style difference, I feel. Even more explained, which is interesting given Melanchthon's propensity to expand. But even by the end, it's not quite the size of the institutes.
I think one of the big difference stylistically is that Calvin is always making an argument, or is very often making an argument, structuring it in such a way that you can he leads you along the path to the conclusion that you ought to land on. Melanchthon does a similar thing, but he does it in a kind of more pedagogical way than like a teacher, as opposed to. I was never in like a debate crew, but from hanging out with the coaches at CUI on that, you can see how they teach their students to do it in a way where this is the right answer if you follow these sort of logical conclusions, A to B to C and on. But Calvin very much does that. Whereas Melanchthon sort of teaches in a, I don't know, I guess I'd say more holistic way. I don't know.
Maybe even more narrative.
Yeah, more narrative. That's good.
For Lutherans, I mean, we said a why and what. Why should you read the Institutes? Probably because it's a lot better than getting sort of secondhand Reformed believe this, Reformed believe that.
Yeah.
Calvin, just like in Lutheranism, Calvin isn't. The Institutes aren't a Reformed quote confession, but they are the basis for that theology needing a confession eventually, right? Or confessions eventually. And so getting to the source of that tradition, or one of the first sources of that tradition, can be helpful in understanding, especially what Luther and Melanchthon would have been rejecting or responding to, or maybe agreeing with in some areas or whatever. And so where is your tradition's interaction with the Reformed? It's actually not with their later confessions of faith primarily. It's with Calvin initially, especially for Melanchthon. The Institutes are published right on top of Luther's death, or right before, I guess. But
It's looking to me like and you can get all the individuals of the Library of Christian Classics from christianbook.com as individuals. I'm not seeing them as a set like you used to be able to, although you can find used sets of the entire set.
50 books in the set, huh?
Yeah. But the entire set's, it's pricey.
Actually, 1,500 is not the. I mean, it's a lot of money. Don't get me wrong.
It's $30 a book essentially.
But it's not the worst I've seen for a collection like that. Yeah. So, it can be, yeah.
But I highly recommend it if you sort of are trying to develop a well-rounded library. You'll get everything from early church fathers in there to reformers, mostly magisterial reformers, but you'll get a full swath in there. There's some Erasmus in there. I mean, it's a good set. It has the paramount books, like it has the Loci, it has the Institutes, it has Bondage of the Will, it has Freedom of the Will. It's got the books you would want to read.
Right.
The edition with the 1521 Loci also has a work by Martin Bucer in there. So anyway, I would recommend them.
Very good. So we got the Institutes. Another Reformed theologian you mentioned, Dad, was Theodore Beza.
Yeah, it would be difficult for me to tell you what to read from Beza. I read some Beza years ago, but I don't actually.
In the Christian classics, there's a Beza and somebody else.
Yeah.
Who is it? Who are paired together? Adam, do you remember?
Yeah. No. Yeah, I don't.
So Beza is kind of like he is in a lot of ways the successor to Calvin. A clear and simple treatise on Lord's Supper. That's what it is.
I guess for Lutherans, sometimes the way he's understood, I don't know if this is one for one, but sometimes referred to as like the Reformed Melanchthon, right?
Yeah, maybe. I think in a lot of ways he's a more sort of specific successor. Especially, I mean, where people go to Beza is sort of these logical necessities that come sometimes Reformed or accused of having. I think a lot of those trace back to Beza more than Calvin. The one that I've read, it was years ago, but we read it in a class, was this a clear and simple treatise on the Lord's Supper. There's not much by Beza translated into English. This is going to be sort of one of your other issues here when you say read some Beza. The only other one that I've ever seen, and I think I had it, probably don't have it anymore, is it's a book on questions and answers, or questions and responses. But it's he's worth checking out because a lot of the sort of very formalized quote unquote Calvinism that you might have heard Calvinists say, or things or Calvinists being accused of saying, can be kind of, in a lot of ways, I think, traced back to the formality and sort of bit of rigidity of Beza.
Yeah, was it B.B. Warfield who made that distinction between Calvin and Calvinism?
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure he credits Beza with not over systematizing Calvin, but pushing Calvin's theology to the next level, making it more of a, shall we say, a totalizing system as opposed to a confession.
Yeah. So, for instance, like if you read Calvin on the Lord's Supper in the Institutes, some of the things that like even I would accuse Calvinists of was sort of like these formal necessities when it comes to, say, where the body of Christ is, and this is why it can't be in the supper, and all this type of thing. That's not really in Calvin. Even Calvin's treatise on the Lord's Supper, he doesn't say anything like that.
I think most Lutherans would find it less offensive than they would think.
Right. Calvin talks about presence, even bodily in a sense, and how, but it's just how he sort of explains it that really gets Lutherans going wacky.
He hedges his bets on it.
Yeah. And Beza, gets very specific on these things and why certain things can be and can't be, quote unquote.
Very, very good.
But worth reading if you can find it. That's not what some of these books. It's always hard when we recommend books because we're going to say, read the Catechism. You'll be able to find that. Read the Bondage to the Will. Oh, you're going to find that. After that,
what about the Anglican tradition?
Might take a little work.
We're going to include that in the Magisterial Reformation, obviously.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
What would you just say? 39 articles?
I would, just because it's going to be so hard
in the Book of Common Prayer
to get anything sort of specific. Otherwise, does that make any sense?
Yeah. Yeah, and there was so much. It's almost like what was going on in England during Henry VIII up until Elizabeth's reign is kind of a microcosm of what was going on in Europe. You've got all sorts of different streams popping up. Some that look very Lutheran, some that look very Reformed, some that are in the middle, some that are very Catholic. And
with the 39 articles, I would be interested for people to read the 1521 Loci, read the Augsburg Confession, read the Institutes, then read the 39 articles, and see how that kind of lands somewhere amongst those books or with influence from two different traditions in there.
Yeah, it'd kind of be right in the middle, huh? Don't they? They always refer to Anglicanism, or they did back when I lived in England, as the via media.
Yeah.
I think you would see that it's very influenced by the sort of the theological substance of the Augsburg Confession, with a bit of the hedging your bets on certain sacraments that happens with, say, Calvin, like we described in the Institutes.
But less to the Reform side and more to the Roman Catholic side. So this is where you get the middle way of Anglicanism. It's funny. I've often said that if you're looking at, if your extremes are Roman Catholicism and the Reformed, specifically like on sacraments and stuff, the real middle way is going to be Lutheranism, in a sense. When they say the middle way, they were doing, there's multiple influences coming in to the English Reformation, starting at Roman Catholic, breaking off for sort of highly political reasons that then get theology applied to them. Mm-hmm. And then the theology that's applied to them early on is very Lutheran influenced. Later has some Reform influence, landing on sort of the real sort of via media, as we would say it today, comes under Elizabeth, which is the last in the line of the English regents, right, who have say over what the Church of England is going to look like. And her influence, she was very much concerned with political peace, right? Because people are dying right and left.
Every time a ruler changes hands, you know.
So she's very interested in that stopping. So you have a lot of the practices, the Roman Catholic practices that remain. And under Elizabeth, even though she's trained and catechized on Melanchthon, right? She's brought up reading Melanchthon's Loci as her sort of theological main influence.
A textbook.
As a textbook. But what happens is the practices become such that they're acceptable to people that see themselves as Roman Catholic to some degree, and by those who and never really to the Reform. That's why they kept having sort of a Reform movement, but that were influenced by Lutheranism and Lutheran writings.
It's amazing how close, like just a handful of political circumstances, especially with Henry VIII. England is to becoming a Church of the Augsburg Confession, right? Like it's really close to happening. And it'd be interesting
if Henry had his way, Melanchthon would have been chair of theology at Cambridge University.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Where?
At Cambridge.
Where's that?
Just kidding.
That's
Oh,
Oxford.
man.
It's that other
Down
school.
there. Down there.
Down.
Cambridge? Oh,
Yeah.
so what? Sorry.
Classic. I would say if you can get your hands on something written by Thomas Cranmer, go ahead and give it a read. It's going to read. You're going to, if you've read some, like if you've done this, if you do this after you've read the Loci, you're going to definitely hear some Melanchthon in Cranmer, but you also hear some hedging of the bets when it comes to certain topics on towards the Roman Catholic side.
Yeah, I also would highly suggest perusing through the Book of Common Prayer, and especially if you're a Lutheran today, just seeing how much of your liturgy in English comes from and is shared with the Book of Common Prayer.
Yeah, I think that you will definitely hear some tonality of the Augsburg Confession in the 39 Articles.
Yeah, very cool. So then, we said the tail end would be sort of what Lutherans would call the second generation of reformers, students of Luther Melanchthon, probably more so of Melanchthon just because he lived longer. He was younger at the start of the whole deal. And we mentioned in particular, I think the most influential of that second generation is Martin Chemnitz. Sometimes
The second Martin.
It is phrased that without the second Martin, nobody would know about the first.
Yeah.
I do not-
Is that
I don't like
that's
that
hyperbole, right?
I think it's hyperbole, yeah.
Yeah.
That's actually at the beginning of, I think that's it's on the back matter of the J.A.O. Preuss, the second Martin biography, which is actually a very good biography and
sounds
does a
good.
lot of Lutheran history. I mean, if you actually want to sort of like get an overview of Lutheran controversy and the things that led up to the Formula of Concord, it's very good for some of that. It's also interesting. There's some things in there like some interesting claims. Like there's a claim that by 1570 the Augsburg Confession would have been considered a writing of Luther's, not Melanchthon. I disagree with that based on sort of other texts from the time, but overall it's pretty good. It's a pretty good book, and it covers Chemnitz's life down to his time studying with Melanchthon, feeling, it seems, the way Preuss puts it, almost kind of feeling betrayed by Melanchthon at the time of the interims.
I think everybody felt a little betrayed at the time of whether we look at it sort of with the benefit of history and say they shouldn't or not. I think they did.
And then down to sort of his work on the formula, and then his expansion of the Loci, and then his work on the two natures of Christ.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to talk to a layperson and just say, hey, pick a book up off the shelf of Chemnitz and read it, it'd be hard to say, hey, why don't you go grab the Examen and read that? I mean, this is, or, hey, two natures of Christ, just make your way through it. You'll be fine. That's probably not highly recommended.
It's not the same kind of lay reading as like the 21 Lochi or the small and
No.
large catechism, is it?
He does. CPH has published his Lochi, which is basically his lecture notes as he's lecturing through Melanchthon's, what we would say 1559 Lochi.
And
So there's a lot of Melanchthon's Lochi in his Lochi, and then his notes on it.
well, and from that helps, like people are like, why does the Thinking Fellows talk about Melanchthon so much? Well, part of it is the history of Lutheranism in America includes prioritizing the translation of Chemnitz Lochi over Melanchthon's, right? So there's like some interesting history there, which says, he was prioritized over Melanchthon.
Well, yeah, the story goes that J.A.O. Preuss sat down with his wife to start translating Chemnitz Lochi, and in the process figured out that he was translating, 90% of Melanchthon's Lochi, and said, well, shoot, might as well just publish that as a translation too. And so finished that up and did it, which is great. I would recommend, on the Theodore Beza side, I'd recommend his treatise on the Lord's Supper to get sort of the hardcore Reformed view of the Lord's Supper. If you want sort of the very developed Lutheran view of the Lord's Supper, I would read Chemnitz's book on the Lord's Supper. I think it's an Enchiridion work on the Lord's Supper.
Yep, and it's not super long. Of them, it's probably the most accessible.
Yeah. Well, so you can get it. I guess they're selling all these in a set now, so I'm getting really confused. So you can get as volume 5 in the Chemnitz Works volume, which these all used to be separate. So excuse my confusion. The Enchiridion, which is essentially a catechism. The book on the Lord's Supper, and then his little book on the Lord's Prayer too. It all comes in volume 5 of Chemnitz work. You used to be able to buy those separately. You might be able to buy Chemnitz on the Lord's Supper separately still. If so, I'd recommend going through. It's very easy to understand, and it'll give you sort of the very fully developed Lutheran view of the Lord's Supper.
Yeah, there's some other small stuff you can find. Like he's got a book for like setting up standards for pastors and stuff, which is that's actually cool in the history of the development of the Reformation. If you look at some of the early stuff and what Luther was dealing with,
that's the Enchiridion. That's Ministry, Word, and Sacrament.
Okay, yep, and there's some good stuff on there. It actually also helps answer some questions like why doesn't the Book of Concord have a list of the books of the Bible in it and things like that. Chemnitz has some work on that as well, so that's very cool.
I would do, if we're doing sort of late volume stuff in our last few minutes, I would recommend Chytraeus on Sacrifice. So it's a very short little book on the atonement. As a site, it was translated by John Montgomery. You can buy it at 1517.org.
Shop.1517.org.
Okay, shop.1517.org. And in the back, you can get, John Montgomery wrote a very helpful sort of explanation of the various views of atonement. In chart form in the back.
Cool.
All right.
Anything else, guys? I'm gonna have a list to compile for the show notes. That's a first not a first, but first time in a long time that it's gonna be like a big list.
All right.
So that'd be very cool. And maybe try to find some Amazon affiliate ads or links or something like that to get some
Smile. We have a Smile account at 1517.
That's true. We do have a Smile account. But if you would like to support us in a more direct way, if you enjoy the Thinking Fellows, been impacted, or learned something on the show, we would appreciate your support. You can do that by going to 1517.org/donate. Another way you can support us is by leaving us a 5-star review on the Apple Podcast app. Some of you have I saw one that I used to say, like, if you can't do 5 stars, just put it anyways and email me. And I did see a review that was like, I did this because Caleb said 5 stars. I'll be contacting you soon. So,
That's great.
Thank you. Yeah. I suppose I suppose for that, that's a helpful way to do that. But yes, if you do enjoy the show, we greatly appreciate those reviews. Some of them are very funny, and others are very encouraging. So we appreciate that. We will catch you next time. Bye.